The autumn wind of 1874 cut through the Wyoming territory like a blade, carrying with it the scent of coming snow and the bitter taste of injustice. Evelyn Morrison sat hunched on the cold, hard-packed earth outside Murphy's saloon in Millhaven, her once white wedding dress now stained with mud and torn at the hem. The fabric, which had been her mother's before consumption claimed her in Ohio, was all she had left of home. And now it was ruined, just like everything else in her 25-year-old life. A purple bruise bloomed across her left cheek, where Amos Calder's calloused hand had struck her not an hour before. The sting had faded, but the humiliation burned fresh as prairie fire. Around her, a line of 6 men shuffled their boots in the dust. Some she recognized from the general store. Others were strangers who'd ridden in from distant ranches near Red Butte or were passing through on the stage route from Cheyenne. They avoided her eyes, but she could feel their hunger, their anticipation, the weight of coins in their pockets that would buy what her husband had promised them. For a moment, a terrible thought flickered through Evelyn's mind like a candle flame in the darkness. She could end this. Tonight. There was a rope in Calder's cabin beams, strong enough to hold her slight frame. She could stop the pain, stop the degradation, stop the slow death of everything she'd once believed herself to be. But then she felt the small locket pressed against her chest beneath her dress, her mother's final gift, containing a pressed violet from their garden in Cincinnati. Eleanor Morrison had died, believing her daughter possessed strength enough for any trial. "Promise me, Evelyn," her mother had whispered on that final day. "Promise me you'll fight for the life I'm leaving you." No, she would not give Calder that final victory. Whatever came next, Eleanor Morrison's daughter would survive it. From across the dusty main street, a tall figure watched from the shadows between Murphy's saloon and Henderson's general store. Nashoba's dark eyes took in every detail, the woman's obvious distress, the men's shameful eagerness, Calder's cruel dominance over the scene. At 35, the Cheyenne warrior carried himself with the controlled power of a man who had faced cavalry charges and lived, who had hunted buffalo across the endless grassland and tracked enemies through mountain passes where the snow never melted. His jaw tightened as memories of his sister's face flashed through his mind, and his hand instinctively moved to the eagle feather hanging from his neck, the sacred token that had protected him through battles with the Crow, through harsh winters when his people had nothing but their courage to keep them alive, through 3 years of guilt that ate at him like acid. Something was about to change in Millhaven. The spirits had been whispering of it for days, and the storm clouds gathering on the horizon seemed to echo their warnings. 2 months earlier, Evelyn had stepped off Pete Morrison's stagecoach with hope in her heart and Calder's sweet letters in her carpetbag. The weathered driver had helped her down with gentle courtesy, his eyes kind beneath the brim of his hat. "First time in Wyoming territory, Miss Bar," Morrison had asked, noting her obvious nervousness as she clutched her single piece of luggage. "Yes, sir. I'm to be married." She'd shown him the carefully preserved letters, the formal invitation to a new life. "Mr. Calder seems a good man, God-fearing, hard-working." Morrison's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing his weathered features. "Amos Calder, you say?" He'd glanced toward the imposing figure waiting by the general store, then back at Evelyn, with something that might have been concern. "Well, miss, I hope everything works out as you're expecting." There had been something in his tone, a warning she'd been too excited to heed. Now, as she sat in the dirt outside the saloon, she wished she'd paid attention to the doubt in Pete Morrison's voice. The lies had begun unraveling the moment she'd said "I do" in Millhaven's tiny church. That very evening, as she'd explored her new home, a modest cabin that seemed to promise happiness, she'd knelt before the fireplace to light a welcoming fire. Among the ashes, she'd found the charred remains of what appeared to be official correspondence. Most of it was illegible, but one fragment had caught her eye, a letterhead bearing the name J. Blackwood, Deputy Territorial Administrator, and the partially burned phrase, "The Indian problem requires immediate She'd puzzled over it briefly, but Calder's return had driven all thoughts of mysterious letters from her mind. He'd stumbled through the door reeking of whiskey and accompanied by two rough-looking men whose eyes stripped her naked before they'd even spoken. "Boys, meet my new wife." He'd slurred, his eyes glittering with something that made Evelyn's stomach clench. "Pretty as advertised, ain't she? Clean-educated, fresh from back east." The explanation had come with brutal clarity. Calder owned a small ranch, yes, but it was mortgaged to the hilt and failing. He owed money to half the territory, gambling debts, loans from banks, payment for supplies he couldn't afford. His solution was simple and monstrous. Evelyn would earn their keep by providing intimate services to men willing to pay cash or forgive debts. Think of it as your wifely duty. He'd set his smile cold as winter moonlight. "We're partners now, and partners help each other out of tight spots." The first time she'd fought like a wildcat. She'd scratched and bitten and screamed until her voice gave out. Calder had beaten her unconscious with methodical efficiency, and she'd awakened in the small shack behind Murphy's saloon with a stranger's hands already working at her dress. Now, 6 weeks later, every Saturday brought the same ritual. Calder would parade her through town to the shack like livestock, going to market, collect payment from a line of men, and spend the money on whiskey, while she endured hours of violation that left her body aching and her soul dying by degrees. The townspeople knew, how could they not? But fear of crossing Calder, combined with Sheriff Hawkins's obvious protection of his old army comrade, kept everyone's eyes averted and mouths shut. There had been whispers, though. Martha Connolly at the boarding house had mentioned seeing the sheriff receiving envelopes from well-dressed strangers who arrived on government horses. Dr. Patterson had been spotted in urgent, hushed conversations with Hawkins in the alley behind his office, conversations that ceased abruptly whenever anyone approached. Something larger was at work in Millhaven, but Evelyn was too trapped in her own nightmare to understand what it might be. Martha Connolly was 63 years old, weathered by 40 years on the frontier, and she'd seen enough cruelty to recognize it when it walked her streets. 3 times in the past 6 weeks, she'd found excuses to bring Evelyn food, a loaf of fresh bread, leftover stew, once even a small bottle of laudanum for the pain. During their last encounter, Martha had whispered urgently, "I've seen this before, child. Another girl 2 years back. Pretty little thing named Rose." Her weathered hands had trembled. "I helped her escape, got her on a stage to Denver. But Calder found out, threatened to burn down my place with me in it." Dr. Patterson had been passing by that day, making his rounds. Evelyn had noticed how he'd slowed his step, clearly overhearing Martha's words. For a moment their eyes had met, and she'd seen something flicker across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or shame. But he'd hurried on without speaking, his medical bag clutched tightly in his white-knuckled grip. Later that same week, Evelyn had witnessed something that chilled her blood. Unable to sleep, she'd ventured to her small window and seen Dr. Patterson meeting Sheriff Hawkins in the alley behind the jail. The conversation was heated, but quiet, punctuated by urgent gestures. She'd seen Hawkins hand the doctor an envelope thick with what looked like money. Patterson had pocketed it quickly, but his face had shown the strain of a man wrestling with his conscience. Whatever hold Calder and Hawkins had over the town ran deeper than simple intimidation. Meanwhile, Nashoba watched and remembered feeling the weight of his sister's death like a stone in his chest. Ayanna had been 17 when the traders took her, sweet-faced and trusting. They'd promised marriage to a good man, promised safety in a world where her people faced increasing pressure from white settlement. Instead, they'd sold her to a brothel in Denver, where she died of disease and despair before her 18th birthday. The guilt had eaten at him for 3 years now, a constant ache that never dulled. He wouldn't let it happen again. Not to another woman. Not while he drew breath. The October storm struck Millhaven with unusual ferocity, turning the main street into a river of mud and driving everyone indoors, except those with business too urgent to postpone. Lightning split the sky, while thunder rolled across the prairie like the hoofbeats of angry spirits. Nashoba had been tracking a wounded elk near Badger Creek when the storm caught him, forcing him to seek shelter in town. He'd never intended to involve himself in white man's business. But as he approached the saloon, the scene unfolding before him made his blood run cold. Through the rain-streaked window, he watched Amos Calder grab Evelyn roughly by the arm and drag her from a corner table where she'd been sitting with empty eyes. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and fresh bruises darkened her throat. 3 men waited by the bar, money already counting in their eager hands. Dr. Patterson sat at a table near the window, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him. The physician's face was flushed, and he studiously avoided looking at what was happening just feet away. When one of the waiting men made a crude joke about Evelyn's appearance, Patterson's hands trembled as he poured another drink, but he said nothing. "Now, come on, damn you." Calder snarled loud enough to be heard over the storm. "These gentlemen paid good money, and they ain't leaving until they get what they came for." Evelyn tried to pull away, her bare feet sliding on the wet wooden floor. "Please, Amos, not tonight. I'm sick, I can barely stand." His backhand sent her stumbling into a chair with a crash. Dr. Patterson's glass paused halfway to his lips, and for a moment it seemed he might intervene. But instead he drained the whiskey and looked away. "You'll do as you're told, woman. We had a deal, remember?" "The deal was marriage," she whispered, touching her split lip. "This isn't what you promised." Calder's laugh was uglier than the storm outside. "Promises don't pay debts, girl. Now get moving before I drag you out there by your hair." But Evelyn had reached some limit that even fear couldn't breach. Instead of moving toward the back door, she dropped to her knees and began crawling toward the front of the saloon, her fingers clawing at the floorboards. "No," she gasped. "No more. I can't. I won't." The men at the bar laughed nervously. This wasn't how these transactions usually went. Evelyn's public resistance was making them uncomfortable, threatening to expose what everyone pretended not to see. Calder's face darkened with rage. He grabbed Evelyn by the hair and hauled her to her feet, ignoring her cry of pain. "You're making a scene, you stupid bitch. Now walk or I'll make you wish you had." That's when Nashoba pushed through the saloon doors. Water dripped from his long black hair and buckskin clothing as he stepped into the warm, whiskey-scented air. Every conversation died. Every eye turned to him. In a territory where tensions between whites and Indians ran high, the appearance of a lone Cheyenne warrior in a saloon was unprecedented. Dr. Patterson's face went pale as he recognized the implications. His hand moved toward his medical bag, an instinctive gesture, but he made no move to leave his table. Nashoba's gaze swept the room, once taking in the frozen tableau, Calder's grip on Evelyn's hair. Her tears, the shame-faced men at the bar, the doctor paralyzed by his own guilt. Then he walked slowly across the room until he stood directly between Calder and the back door. "Let her go," he said quietly. His English was perfect, but it carried the unmistakable weight of absolute conviction. Calder's eyes widened, then narrowed. "What the hell do you think you're doing, savage? This is between me and my wife. Ain't none of your damn business. Your wife is suffering." Nashoba replied, never taking his eyes from Calder's face. "I can see it. They can see it." He nodded toward the men at the bar, who were now shifting uncomfortably. "You will stop." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring while rain hammered the roof, and lightning-illuminated faces pressed against the windows. Half the town had gathered, despite the storm drawn by the primitive magnetism of confrontation. Calder's hand dropped to his gun, a worn Colt .45. "Back off, Redskin, or I'll put a bullet in your gut." Nashoba didn't move, didn't flinch. Behind him, Evelyn had stopped crying. For the first time in 6 weeks, someone was standing between her and the nightmare her life had become. "I know," she whispered so quietly only the 3 of them could hear. Then louder, "No." The metallic click of Calder's gun clearing leather cut through the saloon's tension. His Colt .45 gleamed in the lamplight as he raised it toward Nashoba's chest, his whiskey-soaked confidence making his hand steadier than it should have been. The last warning, savage. Calder growled his finger, finding the trigger. Walk away or die where you stand. Nashoba had faced armed men before cavalry soldiers, claim jumpers, cattle thieves, Crow warriors whose hatred ran generations deep. He'd learned that men like Calder were usually cowards at heart. Their courage came from bottles and bullying, not from warrior discipline. In one fluid motion, Nashoba stepped sideways and struck. His hand chopped down on Calder's wrist with the precision of a tomahawk blow, and the gun discharged harmlessly into the floor with a deafening crash. Before Calder could react, Nashoba grabbed the front of his shirt and hurled him backwards into the bar, sending bottles cascading to the floor. But Nashoba had underestimated Calder's preparation. 3 men immediately rose from tables around the saloon, not customers, but hired hands who'd been positioned throughout the room in case of exactly this kind of interference. "Take him down!" Calder roared, blood streaming from his nose. "Kill the bastard if you have to." The first ranch hand, a burly man named Dutch, swung a chair at Nashoba's head. The Cheyenne warrior ducked and drove his shoulder into Dutch's stomach, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into a support post. The second man, younger and quicker, managed to land a solid punch to Nashoba's ribs that sent pain shooting through his side. The saloon erupted into chaos. Tables overturned as patrons scrambled for cover. The men who'd been paying for Evelyn's services melted away toward the front door, wanting no part of a fight they hadn't bargained for. Murphy grabbed his shotgun, but hesitated to use it with so many people in the way. Dr. Patterson remained at his table, seemingly frozen by the violence. His medical bag sat unopened at his feet, and his face showed the conflict of a man watching people get hurt while doing nothing to help. Nashoba fought with deadly efficiency, but 3 against 1 was difficult odds. The third ranch hand, a wiry man called Spider, caught Nashoba from behind while he was grappling with the second man, wrapping powerful arms around his chest. "Got him!" Spider yelled triumphantly. That's when Evelyn made her move. She'd been forgotten in the chaos, but she'd seen the heavy brass spittoon beside the bar. As Spider held Nashoba, she grabbed it and swung with all her remaining strength at the man's head. The impact sent him staggering his grip, loosening enough for Nashoba to break free and spin around with an elbow that dropped Spider to his knees. But the distraction cost him. Dutch had recovered and caught Nashoba with a wild haymaker that connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. Calder, bleeding but far from defeated, grabbed a broken bottle from the floor-jagged green glass that glinted wickedly. "Hold him still," he screamed, advancing with the improvised weapon. "I'll carve his savage hide into strips." Nashoba saw the attack coming but was trapped between Dutch and the second man, both of whom had recovered enough to grab his arms. The broken bottle descended toward his face in a glittering arc. Then the saloon doors exploded inward with a crash. Sheriff Hawkins stood silhouetted against the storm, his badge glinting and his gun already drawn. Rain streamed from his hat brim, and his eyes took in the chaos with quick assessment. "That's enough," he bellowed. "Everyone freeze." But instead of bringing justice, Hawkins's arrival spelled disaster for Nashoba. The sheriff's eyes barely took in the scene before his conclusion was reached, predetermined perhaps by loyalties that ran deeper than law. His gaze swept over Dr. Patterson, who gave an almost imperceptible nod, then focused entirely on the Indian warrior. "Arrest that Indian." Hawkins ordered, his gun trained on Nashoba. "Charge him with assault, destruction of property, and disturbing the peace." Evelyn tried to speak, but Calder was quicker. "Thank God you came, Sheriff," he gasped, pressing a dirty handkerchief to his bleeding nose. "This savage attacked me and my wife without provocation. We were just having a quiet drink when he went crazy." The 3 ranch hands quickly echoed their boss's fabricated story. Dutch, sporting a rapidly swelling eye, nodded vigorously. Came at us like something out of hell, Sheriff. We barely fought him off. Dr. Patterson finally spoke from his corner table, his voice slurred, but carrying professional authority. Sheriff's right to arrest him. I saw the whole thing. Unprovoked attack on peaceful citizens. Nashoba said nothing as the iron shackles closed around his wrists. He met Evelyn's eyes across the destroyed saloon, and she saw something there she'd almost forgotten existed, unbreakable resolve. As they dragged him toward the door, Evelyn finally found her voice. "He was trying to help me," she cried, but her words were lost in the storm. The Millhaven jail was little more than a stone box with iron bars. Nashoba sat on the narrow cot testing the bandage one of the townswomen had grudgingly provided for his split knuckles. The cell reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. What troubled him wasn't the surroundings he'd endured worse during vision quests and winter hunts. It was the knowledge that Evelyn was still at Calder's mercy, and whatever was happening in that distant cabin couldn't be good. In the cabin, Calder paced like a caged wolf, his rage made worse by the humiliation of being bested by a lone Indian warrior. The bandage across his broken nose was already soaked with blood, and his voice came out in a nasal wheeze. "You brought this on yourself," he snarled at Evelyn, who sat huddled in the corner. "Somehow you got word to that savage, didn't you?" Evelyn shook her head frantically. "I never spoke to him before tonight. I don't even know his name." "Lying bitch." Calder's boot caught her in the ribs, driving the air from her lungs. "You think I'm stupid Indians don't just wander into saloons." The accusation was as false as it was inevitable. Men like Calder couldn't accept that their victims might find help from unexpected sources. It had to be conspiracy betrayal, some elaborate plot. Calder's next words chilled Evelyn's blood. "Well, you got your Indian lover arrested, and now you're going to pay for it. Tomorrow's Sunday, and I've got a special arrangement with some cattle buyers passing through from Denver. They're paying double the usual rate for a whole day with you, and I don't care if they leave you breathing or not." While Calder made his threats 3 miles away at the Cheyenne winter camp along Willow Creek, smoke signals had been rising since sunset. Word of Nashoba's arrest had reached his people within hours, carried by young warriors who'd been watching the town. The tribal council convened immediately in Red Hawk's lodge. Elders sat in a circle around the central fire, their weathered faces painted with shadows and firelight, as they discussed this latest injustice. Red Hawk, Nashoba's father, and one of the band's most respected elders listened grimly as the scouts reported what they'd witnessed. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his hands clenched and unclenched as he processed the news that his son, his only remaining child, had been imprisoned on false charges. "My son acted with honor," he finally declared. "He protected one who could not protect herself. This is the way of our people. The whites have imprisoned him with lies." Spotted Wolf and the war chief, whose battle scars told stories of fights with cavalry and cattle thieves, leaned forward. "They expect us to accept this injustice. They believe we are too few, too weak to challenge them." "What do you counsel?" Red Hawk asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The war chief's smile was sharp as a blade. "Fire can be a useful teacher, Elder. Perhaps the white eyes need to learn that justice has more than one face." At midnight, when the storm had passed, orange flames began dancing against the sky behind Millhaven's jail. The distraction was perfectly timed, a haystack set ablaze far enough from buildings to avoid real damage, but close enough to draw every able-bodied man in town to form bucket brigades. Nashoba had been expecting them. The rhythmic tapping on the stone wall, 3 long, 2 short, 1 long, was a signal he'd known since childhood. The breakout took less than 5 minutes. Spotted Wolf had brought iron tools stolen from a construction site, and the jail's lock was more rust than metal. As Nashoba slipped into the night, his movements silent, as flowing water, the flames behind him were already dying down. He was halfway to where his horse was hidden when Sheriff Hawkins emerged from an alley, his shotgun gleaming in the moonlight. "Figured you'd try something like this." Hawkins growled, raising the weapon. His voice carried a note of satisfaction, as if this confrontation had been planned. Should have known better than to trust Indians to follow the law. Nashoba dove sideways as the shotgun roared pellets, chewing splinters from a fence post where his head had been. He rolled behind a water trough as Hawkins pumped another shell into the chamber. The sheriff had the angle, and the next shot would find its mark. Nashoba tensed, preparing to make a desperate charge, when Spotted Wolf's arrow sprouted from Hawkins's shoulder like a deadly flower. The steel point punched through flesh and muscles, spinning the lawman around and sending his second shot wild. "Ye go," Spotted Wolf shouted from the shadows. "We'll hold them." Nashoba ran for the hills with the sheriff's curses echoing behind him. But Hawkins wasn't finished. Despite the arrow in his shoulder, he managed to raise his shotgun one last time and fire into the darkness. Most of the pellets missed, but 3 found their target, tearing through Nashoba's left shoulder and sending him stumbling with warm blood streaming down his arm. The wounds were deep, painful, but not immediately fatal. Adrenaline and warrior training kept him moving despite the injury. Behind him, the whole town was awakening to shouts and gunfire. By dawn, every able-bodied man would be on his trail. As he reached his horse, a paint stallion that had carried him through countless hunts, Nashoba felt the blood loss beginning to weaken him. The shoulder wound was worse than he'd initially thought. One of the pellets had nicked an artery, and his vision was starting to blur. But he couldn't stop, couldn't rest. Not while Evelyn remained in Calder's hands, not while injustice walked free in the territory his people had called home for countless generations. Dawn broke gray and cold over Millhaven, painting the prairie in shades of ash and iron. Evelyn sat at the small table in Calder's cabin, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She hadn't slept every time she'd closed her eyes. She'd seen Nashoba's face as they dragged him away, seen the unbreakable resolve that remained intact, even in defeat. That inner strength had awakened something in her that 6 weeks of brutality hadn't quite managed to kill. For the first time since arriving in this nightmare, she'd seen what real courage looked like. The warrior had risked everything for a woman he didn't even know, asking nothing in return except the chance to do what was right. A soft scratching at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it cautiously, expecting to find Calder returning from whatever business had taken him out before sunrise. Instead, she found a piece of paper that had been slipped under the door, weighed down with a small stone. The paper was stained with what looked like dried blood, and the handwriting was shaky, urgent. "Child, your friend escaped, but they're spreading lies about you helping him. I've seen this before. I helped another girl like you 2 years back, a sweet thing named Rose. Got her to Denver safely, but Calder found out and threatened to burn me out. I kept quiet after that, but I can't watch it happen again. He's coming for you tonight. The doctors turned against you now too, saw him take money from the sheriff again yesterday. God help us both. Martha." Evelyn's hands shook as she read the words. Martha Connolly, the boarding house woman, who'd shown her kindness when no one else would. Now Martha was risking everything again, despite the previous threats. The mention of Dr. Patterson chilled her. She'd seen the physician's hesitation in the saloon, had hoped that medical ethics might compel him to help. If even he had turned against her, then Calder's influence ran deeper than she'd imagined. Heavy boots on the porch announced Calder's return. Evelyn quickly crumpled the note and shoved it into her dress pocket, but her guilty expression gave her away the moment he walked through the door with blood on his knuckles and murder in his eyes. What's that you're hiding?" Calder demanded, his voice rough from shouting orders and threats. His eyes were red-rimmed with fury and sleeplessness, and he moved with the dangerous unpredictability of a wounded animal. "Nothing." Evelyn lied, taking a step backward until her back hit the wall. Calder's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with crushing force. "Don't lie to me, woman. I can smell deception on you like cheap perfume." He twisted her arm until she cried out and released the crumpled paper. His face went through several shades of purple as he read Martha's warning, his breathing becoming harsh and labored. "So," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet, "my loving wife's been getting help from that dried-up old biddy at the boarding house. It's not true." Evelyn gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I never met that man before last night. Martha was just being kind." But Calder was beyond reason, beyond any appeal to logic or mercy. The humiliation of the previous evening, combined with the sheriff's injury and the town's inevitable gossip, had pushed him past his breaking point. In his whiskey-soaked mind, everything made perfect sense now. The Indian's intervention, Evelyn's resistance, the way she'd looked at her supposed rescuer. That old witch has been filling your head with ideas. He snarled, backhanding her across the face hard enough to split her lip and send blood spattering across the cabin's rough walls. "Well, we'll see how much she cares about you when the whole territory knows what you are." He dragged her out into the main street by her hair, ignoring her screams and pleas. The early morning crowd was larger than usual. Word of the previous night's excitement had drawn people from their homes, and the bloody bandage on Calder's nose made him look like a wounded, dangerous animal. "Gather round," he shouted, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "See what kind of woman I married, a lying, cheating whore who spreads her legs for savages." He threw Evelyn down in the dirt and began kicking her, while she curled into a ball, trying to protect her head and stomach. Some of the watching townspeople looked uncomfortable, but no one moved to intervene. Dr. Patterson stood in the doorway of his office across the street, his medical bag in hand, but he made no move to help the injured woman. She helped that Indian escape. Calder continued his rant, punctuating each word with another kick. "Probably been meeting him for weeks, planning it all out. Well, here's what happens to traitors in my house." That's when the stagecoach pulled up with a rattle of wheels and thunder of hooves. Pete Morrison had originally planned to push through to Denver without stopping, but his horses needed water, and the commotion in the street had caught his attention. Morrison was a weathered man of 55 who'd been running routes through the territory for 15 years. He'd seen his share of domestic disputes, and he'd learned long ago that getting involved usually meant nothing but trouble. But something about this scene struck him as different, more vicious than usual. The woman was barely conscious, blood pooling beneath her face, and the man standing over her looked capable of murder. More importantly, Morrison recognized the significance of what he was witnessing. 3 weeks ago, he'd negotiated safe passage through Cheyenne territory with a tribal delegation that included a tall warrior who'd spoken perfect English and worn an eagle feather necklace. That warrior had been respectful, intelligent, and honorable, nothing like the savage Calder was describing. Morrison's business depended on maintaining good relations with all the tribes along his route. But deeper than business considerations was a personal pain that made this scene unbearable to watch. 5 years ago, his own daughter had died of cholera on this same route, and he'd been powerless to save her. Sometimes a man had to take a stand. "That's enough," Morrison called out, climbing down from his coach box with deliberate authority. "I was in that saloon last night, and I saw what really happened." Calder stopped kicking, his attention shifting to this unexpected challenger. "Stay out of this, old man. This is family business." "No, sir, it's not." Morrison walked directly into the circle of spectators, his presence commanding attention through sheer moral weight. "I saw that Indian walk into Murphy's place, and I saw what provoked him. You were forcing that woman against her will, and when she resisted, you got violent. That warrior was protecting her from you." A murmur went through the crowd. Morrison wasn't just any witness. He was known throughout the territory as an honest businessman, someone who dealt fairly with settlers and Indians alike. Calder's face went livid. "You calling me a liar, Morrison? I'm calling you what you are," Morrison replied calmly. He pulled paper and pencil from his coat with practiced efficiency. I'm writing down exactly what I saw signing it and having it witnessed. Let's see what the territorial authorities make of your story when they read mine." The stagecoach driver began writing immediately, speaking each phrase aloud. "On the night of October 15th, 1874, I witnessed Amos Calder forcing his wife against her will to provide intimate services to paying customers. When she resisted, he became violent. A Cheyenne warrior intervened only to protect the woman from further harm. Calder's men attacked the Indian first. Several townspeople pressed closer to watch, and Morrison made sure they could see every word. When he finished, he held the paper up for all to see. "I need witnesses," he announced. "Men who'll sign their names to verify what I've written." Tom Bailey, the merchant who ran the general store, stepped forward first. His signature was careful and clear, and he handed the paper back to Morrison with a nod. Morrison folded the paper and prepared to hand it to Bailey for safekeeping. But Evelyn, still lying in the dirt, but more alert than anyone realized, managed to lift her head. Through swollen eyes, she saw what was happening, understood that this piece of paper might be the only evidence that could save both her and Nashoba. With the last of her strength, she lunged forward and grabbed the statement from Bailey's hands, clutching it to her chest like a lifeline. "You little bitch!" Calder roared, reaching for the paper. "Give that here." But Morrison stepped between them, his hand resting meaningfully on the gun at his hip. "The lady can keep what's rightfully evidence, Mr. Calder. And if anything happens to her or that paper, I'll make sure the territorial marshal knows exactly who to look for." The standoff lasted for several long seconds, with the entire town holding its breath. Finally, Calder stepped back, but his eyes promised terrible retribution. "This ain't over," he growled. Morrison tipped his hat to Evelyn, who was still clutching the blood-stained statement. "Ma'am, you hold on to that tight. It might save your life and that Indian's too." As the stagecoach rolled out of town, Calder was already making plans. The signed statement was a problem, but problems could be solved if a man was willing to get his hands dirty. All he needed was for both the woman and the paper to disappear, and he knew exactly how to make that happen. But first, he had a telegram to send to Cheyenne. James Blackwood needed to know that their carefully laid plans were starting to unravel. The deputy territorial administrator had invested too much in this operation to let one rebellious woman and a meddling Indian destroy everything they'd worked for. Calder walked to the telegraph office, his mind already composing the message that would seal Evelyn's fate. He didn't notice the small figure watching from the boarding house window or the way Martha Connolly's weathered hands trembled as she began composing a letter of her own. The abandoned barn stood 3 miles east of Millhaven, a skeletal reminder of some settler's failed dreams. Built from rough-hewn timber and faith in the future, it had been empty for 2 years since drought and grasshoppers had driven the original owner back to Iowa. Now it served as shelter for passing cattle drives and the occasional outlaw looking to lay low. It was the perfect place for murder. Evelyn had been asleep when they came for her exhaustion, finally overcoming pain and fear in the small hours before dawn. She'd hidden Morrison's signed statement beneath her mattress, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and blood. The paper represented hope, fragile and distant, but real. The first she knew of danger was a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and another dragging her from bed with brutal efficiency. Dutch and Jake, 2 of Calder's ranch hands, had crept through the cabin's back window while their boss waited outside with the wagon, smoking cigarettes and checking his pocket watch like a man with a schedule to keep. "Now make a sound, and I'll cut your throat right here." Dutch whispered, his knife blade cold against her neck. "We're going for a little ride." They bound her hands with rope and threw a burlap sack over her head before carrying her outside into the cold night air. The last thing she heard before losing consciousness from a blow to the head was Calder's voice. "Make sure you get that paper, boys. We can't leave any loose ends." When she woke, she was lying on moldy straw in the barn's dim interior, her ankles tied as securely as her wrists. Pale moonlight filtered through gaps in the walls, and she could hear voices outside, arguing in harsh whispers. Just shoot her and be done with it. Jake was saying his voice nervous but determined. Bullet to the head, dump the body in Snake Creek Ravine. Blame it on that Indian if anyone comes asking. Too many questions. Calder replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to giving orders. Sheriff's already suspicious about last night, especially with that arrow in his shoulder. We need this to look like something else. Maybe that savage came back for revenge and burned the place down with her in it. Dutch's laughter was ugly, the sound of a man who enjoyed others' suffering. Indian justice, eh? I like it. Poetic, you might say. Through the barn's walls, Evelyn could hear them moving around the slosh of liquid from metal containers. The sharp smell that reached her nostrils made her stomach clench with terror kerosene. They were going to burn her alive, make it look like the work of a vengeful Cheyenne warrior. She tested her bonds frantically, ignoring the rope burns that formed on her wrists as she twisted and pulled. The knots were expertly tied, but near her feet she spotted salvation, a piece of broken glass from a whiskey bottle, its edge sharp enough to cut. Working herself around until she could reach the shard with her bound hands, Evelyn began sawing at the rope with desperate determination. Each movement sent splinters of pain through her arms, but she didn't dare stop. The glass was slippery with her blood, but it was cutting through the fibers. Outside, the voices were getting closer to the barn. You sure this will work? Jake sounded nervous now that they were actually going through with murder. Course it'll work, Calder snapped. Fire destroys evidence. Everyone knows Indians burn things when they're angry. Hell, maybe that warrior did come back and we're just too late to save my poor wife. The first rope strand parted, just as orange light began flickering under the barn door. They'd started the fire. Smoke was already creeping through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the acrid stench of burning kerosene and dry wood. Evelyn worked the glass more frantically, tears streaming down her face as the smoke grew thicker and the temperature began to rise. The ancient timber was catching quickly, decades of drought, having turned the barn into a tinderbox. Another rope strand parted, then another. Her left hand was almost free, but time was running out. She could hear the fire roaring like a living thing, consuming everything in its path with mindless hunger. Through the growing conflagration's roar, she heard Calder and his men mounting their horses. "Burn in hell, you cheating whore." Calder called out, his voice already growing distant, as they rode away to establish their alibis. Maybe your Indian lover will be along to join you soon. The rope finally gave way, as burning debris began falling from the ceiling like deadly rain. Evelyn rolled away from a glowing ember that landed inches from her hair and then started working on the bonds around her ankles. These knots were tighter, more complex, and her fingers were already numb from smoke inhalation. The barn was becoming an inferno, the heat so intense that her skin was beginning to blister. A support beam cracked overhead with a sound like thunder 30 seconds before it would fail completely. She could hear the timbers groaning under the weight of flame and heat. 25 seconds. The ankle ropes wouldn't give way. Her lungs burned with every breath. 20 seconds. The beam cracked again, louder this time. Pieces of the roof began falling. 15 seconds. The glass shards slipped from her bloody fingers, skittering across the floor. 10 seconds. She dove for the glass, grabbed it again, began sawing frantically. 5 seconds. The beam gave way with a crack that shook the entire structure. That's when she heard hoofbeats approaching through the roar of flames, the sound of salvation riding hard through the night. Nashoba had been tracking them for 2 hours, following the wagon ruts through the moonlit prairie despite the fever that made his vision swim, and the shoulder wound that sent spikes of agony through his body with every heartbeat. The blood loss was severe. His shirt was soaked through, and more than once he'd almost fallen from his horse's back as weakness threatened to overwhelm him. The sight of the burning barn sent ice through his veins, despite the fever heat that consumed him. Orange flames roared 50 feet into the sky, and he could hear the structure groaning as it began to collapse. Through the conflagration's roar, he heard a woman scream. Evelyn was trapped inside that hell, and she was running out of time. Calder and his men were nowhere to be seen, having fled to establish their alibis. Nashoba slid from his horse's back and staggered toward the barn, his wounded shoulders screaming in protest. The heat hit him like a physical blow when he was still 20 feet away. But he pressed forward. The main door was impassable flame. On the barn's east side, he spotted a section where the boards had warped, creating gaps. Throwing his full weight against the weakened planks, he managed to crack one with his second attempt, then widened the gap with his knife. "Here." Evelyn's voice was barely audible over the roar. "I'm here." Nashoba could see her through the smoke and flames, but 30 feet of burning hell lay between them. He ripped off his shirt, soaked it with water from his canteen, and wrapped it around his head before crawling into the inferno. The heat was indescribable. His skin blistered almost immediately, and his lungs screamed for clean air. But he kept moving toward Evelyn's voice, guided by warrior instincts that functioned even when conscious thought failed. He found her huddled near the far wall, her dress smoldering and her face streaked with soot. "You came." She gasped, disbelief and hope warring in her voice. "Can you move?" he asked, his voice a harsh rasp from smoke inhalation. She nodded, and together they began the nightmare journey back toward the hole he'd created. The barn was collapsing around them, beams crashing down in showers of sparks. Above them, the roof sagged ominously. Halfway to the exit, the blood loss finally overcame Nashoba's iron will. His vision went black, and he collapsed unconscious, his body hitting the burning straw with a thud. Evelyn saw him fall and knew they were both going to die unless she acted. Near his fallen form, she spotted his canteen knocked loose in the fall. With strength born of desperation, she grabbed it and poured the remaining water over his face, then slapped him hard across the cheek. "Wake up!" she screamed over the roar of flames. "We're not dying here. Your sister, she's counting on us." The shock of cold water and pain brought Nashoba back to consciousness, just as a massive beam crashed down behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. A piece of flaming wood struck Evelyn's left leg, setting her dress on fire. She beat at the flames with her hands, ignoring the pain as the fire seared her skin. Together, supporting each other, they stumbled toward the hole Nashoba had created. The barn was coming apart completely now, but they were almost there. Just as they reached the gap, the wind changed. A powerful gust from across the prairie caught the flames and drove them directly toward the exit, cutting off their escape route with a wall of orange death. The wind was strong, unrelenting, channeling the fire through the only opening like a deadly funnel. The back wall. Evelyn shouted, pointing to where another section of weathered boards might give way. But to reach it, they'd have to cross directly through the path of falling debris from the collapsing roof. Nashoba gathered his remaining strength and threw himself at the back wall, his shoulder connecting with a weak board. The impact sent agony through his wounded body, but the plank cracked. Evelyn joined him, and together they pounded at the wall as burning timber rained down around them. The wall gave way, just as the main support beam overhead snapped with a sound like thunder. Nashoba shoved Evelyn through the opening and dove after her as the entire roof came crashing down in an avalanche of flame and destruction. They rolled away from the collapsing structure, their clothes still smoldering, gasping the clean night air. Behind them, the entire barn had become a pillar of fire that could be seen for miles across the dark prairie. But their ordeal was far from over. 3 riders emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, Calder and his 2 remaining men, drawn back by the sight of 2 figures escaping what should have been their funeral pyre. "Son of a bitch." Calder snarled, spurring his horse forward. "They're still alive. Kill them both before they can talk." Dutch raised his rifle, but Nashoba, despite his wounds and weakness, rolled to his feet and drew his knife. The blade gleamed in the firelight as he stepped protectively in front of Evelyn. Calder pulled his own gun and fired. The bullet whispered past Evelyn's head so close she felt the wind of its passage. Before Calder could fire again, Nashoba charged with the desperate speed of a man protecting someone he'd sworn to save. With his good arm, he hurled the knife. The blade spun through the air, glinting in the firelight, and buried itself deep in Calder's gun hand. The man screamed and dropped his weapon, blood spurting from between his fingers. But Calder wasn't finished. Even wounded, he pulled a second knife from his boot and leaped from his horse, landing heavily in the dirt. The two men collided in a tangle of limbs, rolling dangerously close to the edge of the inferno. Calder was heavier and less injured, his bulk giving him an advantage in close combat. They grappled for control of his knife, rolling in the dirt and ash. Nashoba's strength was failing rapidly. The shoulder wounds were bleeding freely again, and his movements were becoming sluggish. Dutch, meanwhile, had recovered from his shock and was raising his rifle again, this time aiming at Evelyn. The range was close, and there would be no missing at this distance. But what none of them had noticed was the desperate plan already set in motion hours earlier. Martha Connolly's letter had reached its destination, carried by a rider who'd left town before dawn. Pete Morrison, alerted to the danger, had turned his stagecoach around and was racing back toward Millhaven with a cargo more precious than gold, territorial marshal's deputies armed with federal warrants. More immediately, the pillar of flame rising from the abandoned barn had been visible from the Cheyenne camp. Red Hawk and his warriors were already riding hard across the prairie, guided by the fire's glow and the certain knowledge that where there was flame, there was likely injustice. The sound that saved Evelyn's life wasn't the thunder of many hoofbeats from town, but the whistle of an arrow that took Dutch in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his shot wide. Spotted Wolf and a dozen Cheyenne warriors emerged from the darkness like avenging spirits, their war paint stark in the firelight. Calder, straddling Nashoba's chest with his knife poised for a killing blow, suddenly found himself surrounded by mounted warriors whose arrows were all trained on him. His face went white as he realized that his perfect crime had become a very public execution. "Drop the knife," Spotted Wolf commanded in English, his bow drawn and ready. "Step away from our brother." But Calder's desperation had driven him beyond rational thought. Instead of surrendering, he pressed the blade closer to Nashoba's throat. "Stay back or I'll cut him ear to ear." That's when the real thunder of hoofbeats announced the arrival of half the town of Millhaven. Pete Morrison led the charge, followed by the federal deputies he'd brought back with him. And behind them came townspeople, drawn by the pillar of flame that had been visible for miles. Dr. Patterson was among them, his face pale with the knowledge of what he would find. The physician's conscience had finally overcome his fear, and he'd ridden out into the night, carrying the medical supplies he should have brought long ago. The scene that greeted them was one that would be burned into the memory of everyone present: a desperate man holding a knife to the throat of a wounded warrior, surrounded by armed Cheyenne, while a woman who should have been dead sat in the dirt, clutching evidence that could bring down the territorial government. "Well," Morrison said loudly, his voice carrying to everyone present, "looks like we arrived just in time to prevent a murder." The arrival of so many witnesses caused Calder to hesitate, the knife still poised above Nashoba's throat. That moment of uncertainty was all the warrior needed. With his last reserve of strength, he bucked upward, throwing Calder off balance, and rolled away from the killing blow. Evelyn struggled to sit up, pulling Morrison's signed statement from her dress. The paper was singed, but still readable. "He did it," she gasped, pointing at Calder with a trembling finger. "Him and his men. They tied me up and set the fire. I have proof." The crowd murmured angrily as Morrison read his statement aloud. But it was Dr. Patterson who provided the most damning testimony. The physician had dismounted and was kneeling beside the injured pair, his hands shaking as he opened his medical bag. I should have helped sooner," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd's angry murmur. "God forgive me, I should have spoken up months ago." He looked up at the assembled crowd, his face pale but determined. I've been taking money from Calder to keep quiet about the women, to treat their injuries without asking questions, to back up his stories when needed. But there's more, much more. A shocked silence fell over the crowd. Dr. Patterson was one of the most respected men in town, and his admission sent ripples of disbelief through the assembled townspeople. Sheriff Hawkins isn't just protecting Calder out of old loyalty. Patterson continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. They're both on the payroll of someone in the territorial government, a man named Blackwood, who's been funding operations to stir up trouble with the Indian tribes. Dutch, wounded but desperate to save his own skin, decided to add his testimony. "It's true," he gasped. "Calder's got letters from this Blackwood, government money, lots of it, for creating incidents with the tribes. They wanted to make it look like the Indians were attacking settlers so the army could move in and take their land. The revelation that this wasn't just personal cruelty, but part of a larger conspiracy, sent shockwaves through the crowd. What they'd witnessed was part of a deliberate strategy to provoke conflicts that could justify seizing Indian lands. But the most damning evidence came from Evelyn herself. Despite her injuries and exhaustion, she managed to produce the small leather journal she'd grabbed during her captivity. "I found this in Calder's cabin," she said, her voice growing stronger as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "It's all here. The payments, the plans, and something else." Morrison read from the journal with growing horror. "Blackwood will dispose of me if this operation fails," he quoted. "I'm just another tool to him, expendable like the women. Need insurance against betrayal. If I go down, I'm taking Hawkins with me. His cousin won't be able to protect him from federal charges." The revelation that Sheriff Hawkins and the territorial administrator were related explained the long-standing protection Calder had enjoyed. It also revealed the scope of the corruption that had infected the local government. Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face grim. "I've got something to add to this testimony," he announced. "Last year, this Blackwood tried to recruit me to his operation. Wanted me to report on Indian movements, stir up trouble along my stage route. When I refused, he threatened to have my route licenses revoked. He pulled a letter from his coat, one he'd kept as insurance against retaliation. I've got his written offer right here, including details about the payments and the ultimate goal of provoking Indian attacks to justify military intervention." The federal deputies Morrison had brought back with him stepped forward, their faces grim, as they took in the scope of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. "We'll need all this evidence," one of them announced. "This goes far beyond local crimes. We're looking at a federal conspiracy to defraud the government and incite violence against Native Americans." But there was still the immediate matter of Calder to deal with. The man sat in the dirt, blood still dripping from his wounded hand, his face showing the strain of a man who'd seen his carefully constructed world collapse around him. "You don't understand," he said desperately, looking around at the hostile faces surrounding him. "I didn't have a choice. Blackwood said if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure I lost everything. He's got judges, marshals, half the territorial government in his pocket. You think taking me down will change anything?" Spotted Wolf, still mounted, and with his bow ready, spoke for the first time. "Among my people, a man who hurts women and children is not considered a man at all. He is cast out, made to live alone until he dies or learns honor. This one will never learn honor." The war chief's words carried the weight of absolute moral authority, and they struck home with the assembled crowd. These people had failed once, allowing their fear and prejudice to blind them to obvious injustice. They wouldn't fail again. Tom Bailey stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of frontier justice. "We've got enough evidence to convict him of multiple murders, conspiracy, and treason. The question is, do we wait for territorial authorities who might be corrupted, or do we handle this ourselves?" But Pete Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Actually, we don't have to choose," he said. "These federal deputies have full authority to arrest and transport prisoners. Calder and his men will face federal justice, and the evidence we've gathered will ensure that justice is real and final." The crowd murmured its approval. This was better than frontier justice. This was the law working as it should, uncompromised by local corruption or political influence. As the federal deputies moved to arrest Calder and his surviving men, Dr. Patterson continued his work on Nashoba's wounds. The warrior had lost a dangerous amount of blood, and his condition was serious but not critical. "You'll live," Patterson told him quietly. "But you need real medical care, not field dressing. I've got supplies back in town." Nashoba nodded weakly, then turned to Evelyn. "You kept fighting," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with respect. "Your mother would be proud." Evelyn felt tears start in her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than despair. For the first time in months, she could see a future that didn't involve pain or degradation. "So would your sister," she replied. "We honored their memory tonight." As the crowd began to organize for the journey back to town, Spotted Wolf approached the pair. The war chief's painted face was stern, but his eyes showed approval. "My son acted with honor," he said, addressing both Nashoba and Evelyn. "Both of you did. Among our people this night will be remembered as proof that courage knows no color and that justice can still prevail when good people choose to act." He turned to address the assembled crowd. "The Cheyenne Nation will remember those who stood with us tonight. Pete Morrison, Dr. Patterson, Martha Connolly, Tom Bailey. Your names will be spoken with respect around our fires." The ride back to Millhaven was slow and careful, with Dr. Patterson monitoring both Nashoba and Evelyn for signs of shock or infection. The federal deputies had taken custody of Calder and his men, while the evidence Morrison's statement, the journal, the letters, was carefully preserved for the trials that would follow. As they neared the town, Pete Morrison rode up beside the wagon, carrying the injured pair. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said. "Miss Evelyn, if you're still interested in that teaching position in Denver, I know some people who run a school specifically for children who've been through difficult times. They could use someone who understands what it means to survive." Evelyn considered the offer carefully. "What about the investigation? Won't they need me to testify?" "The federal courts will come to you," Morrison assured her. "Your testimony is too important to risk losing. You'll be under federal protection until this is all sorted out." Dr. Patterson looked up from where he was checking Nashoba's bandages. "And you, son, will need at least a month of recovery time. I'd be honored to provide that care if you'll accept it from an old fool who should have acted sooner." Nashoba managed a weak smile. "Honor recognizes honor, Doctor. Your conscience brought you here tonight. That's what matters." 3 days later, as Evelyn prepared to leave Millhaven on Morrison's Denver-bound stage, the full scope of their victory was becoming clear. Federal investigators had arrived with warrants for James Blackwood and several other territorial officials. Sheriff Hawkins, facing federal charges and the loss of his cousin's protection, had turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. The network that had preyed on vulnerable women and sought to incite racial violence was being systematically dismantled, with investigations spreading across 3 territories. As the stagecoach prepared to depart, Nashoba approached Evelyn one last time. He was still weak from his injuries, but he was determined to see her off properly. From around his neck, he lifted the eagle feather pendant, the symbol of warrior honor that had protected him through battle and danger. "Among my people," he said, placing the leather cord gently around her neck. "This represents courage that cannot be broken by any force on earth. You showed such courage. You earned this through your own strength." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as her fingers touched the feather. She thought of her mother's final words, of the promise to fight for the life she'd been given, of Nashoba's sister, whose memory had driven him to risk everything for a stranger. "I can't take this," she said, though her hands didn't move to remove the pendant. "It's yours. It means everything to your people. It means that honor recognizes honor." Nashoba interrupted gently. My sister would have wanted you to have it. She would have seen herself in your struggle, would have understood the courage it took to survive what you survived. Evelyn thought of all the young people she would teach in Denver, children who had suffered trauma and abuse, who needed to know that survival was possible and that they weren't alone. I promise you, and I promise her memory. I'll wear this with honor. I'll use the strength it represents to help others who suffer as we have suffered. They stood together in the early morning light, two people who had found something precious in the ashes of tragedy. Not love that would have been inappropriate given the circumstances of their meeting, but something deeper and more lasting. Mutual respect earned through shared ordeal, trust forged in the crucible of near death, and the knowledge that true courage exists in the most unexpected places. As the stagecoach rolled away from Millhaven, Evelyn looked back one last time at the town that had been both her prison and the place of her liberation. The eagle feather rested against her heart, a reminder that she was no longer a victim, but a survivor, no longer powerless, but equipped with the strength to help others find their own path to freedom. Behind her, Nashoba stood with his father and the other Cheyenne warriors who had ridden to his aid. The healing would take time, both the physical wounds and the deeper scars left by injustice, but healing would come. The evidence they had gathered would ensure that James Blackwood and his co-conspirators faced the full weight of federal justice, and the reforms that followed would protect both women and Native Americans from similar exploitation. 6 months later, Evelyn stood before her first class in Denver, 12 children between the ages of 8 and 16, all of whom had suffered trauma that left them wary of trusting adults. She wore a simple blue dress appropriate for teaching, and around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, hung an eagle feather that reminded her daily of the strength that had carried her through the darkest period of her life. "My name is Miss Morrison," she told them, her voice gentle but confident. "I know that some of you have been through terrible things. I want you to know that I understand because I've been there too. But I also want you to know something else. You are stronger than you think, braver than you know, and capable of building a future that no one can take away from you." One of the children, a girl of perhaps 10 with old eyes and careful movements, raised her hand tentatively. "How do you know?" she asked. "How do you know we're strong enough?" Evelyn smiled, touching the hidden feather through her dress. "Because someone once risked everything to save me when I couldn't save myself. And because I learned that real strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up every time life knocks you down, and then reaching out to help others do the same." 500 miles away in the Wyoming Territory, Nashoba was addressing a gathering of tribal leaders and territorial officials, negotiating a treaty that would protect Cheyenne lands while establishing trading relationships that benefited both peoples. His shoulder had healed, though it still ached in cold weather, and his standing among his people had been enhanced by his role in exposing the conspiracy that had threatened them all. The white woman who helped expose these crimes, he told the gathering, showed us that courage has many faces. She proved that people of good heart can work together regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. The Cheyenne Nation will remember her service to justice, just as we remember all who stand with us against those who would do harm. The eagle feather Evelyn wore had been replaced by one from Nashoba's own collection, but its meaning remained unchanged. Both of them carried the memory of their shared ordeal, and both had found ways to transform their suffering into service to others. Years later, when historians wrote about the territorial period of Wyoming, they would note several significant developments: the exposure of the Blackwood conspiracy, which led to major reforms in territorial administration, the establishment of the first victim protection laws in the Western Territories, and the successful negotiation of treaties that prevented the Indian wars that had seemed inevitable just a few years earlier. They would also note the founding of Morrison Academy in Denver, a school for traumatized children that became a model for similar institutions across the West. The school's motto, carved in stone above the entrance, read simply, "Courage recognizes courage." But the historians would never know the full story of how it all began, with a Cheyenne warrior walking into a saloon on a stormy night, willing to risk everything for a woman whose name he didn't even know, whose courage would prove to match his own when the moment of testing came. Some acts of bravery echo through history in ways their authors never imagined, creating ripples that spread far beyond the original moment of choice. In the case of Nashoba and Evelyn, those ripples became waves of change that transformed not just a territory, but the lives of countless people who would never know their names, but would benefit from their courage. The eagle still soars over Wyoming territory, and in its flight, some say you can still see the spirits of those who fought for what was right when it seemed impossible, who proved that love of justice can overcome fear of power, who showed that the human spirit, when tested by the harshest trials, emerges not destroyed, but purified, not broken, but stronger than ever before. And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the wind whispers across the plains, old-timers still tell the story of the night. Courage came to Millhaven not in the form of an army or a cavalry charge, but in the simple act of one person refusing to let evil triumph over good, and another finding the strength to fight back when fighting back seemed impossible. It's a story about the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it, about the way justice delayed can still become justice delivered when good people finally find the courage to act, and about the truth that real strength comes not from dominating others, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of all.